It was the absolute right booking decision here. Have both men look like equals. Hogan fell to the outside and it looked like he had blown his knee out, giving the Warrior a little time to zone in on the injury, but within seconds, Hogan's knee had magically healed and the match played out as if nothing had happened. This was odd for sure. I think Hogan was trying to play possum. He did give Warrior a thumb to the eye afterwards, but it just didn't translate well on TV. Things started getting even more strange when Hulk Hogan began getting the upper hand in the match, something that normally never happened. Hogan's matches were all about the heroic comeback, so it's strange to see a Hulk Hogan match during this time period that had Hogan in the driver's seat for so long. You have to remember that the Warrior was not used to long main event matches though. Warrior was all about the entrance and the character. He would smash his opponents in no time at all, win the match and leave the ring. He was limited in the squared circle, and so was Hogan to be fair, but the Hulkster had the experience here. It made sense for Hogan to set the pace and be the aggressor. If you need proof, when Warrior got back on his feet to mount some offense, he performed clothesline after clothesline, running from one side of the ring to the other without much wrestling going on, to be honest. Now, I'm not trying to pick apart the Ultimate Warrior here. This was his ring style and it worked for him. It got fans on their feet and it made the people scream and shout, and that's really all you can ask for. However, I think Vince McMahon knew that a typical Ultimate Warrior match wouldn't quite cut it in the main event of WrestleMania, and so Hogan was able to take control of the match much more than his opponent. Warrior was able to get a bear hug on Hogan that lasted a very long time. The referee got wiped out after Hogan broke the bear hug, and Hogan pinned Warrior for the 1-2-3 while the ref was out cold. This was your Hogan insurance policy right here, folks. Hogan would have won the bout had the referee been there to make the count. The same thing happened moments later when Warrior pinned Hogan, but Hogan had Warrior beat first, of course. The audience went into overdrive when Hogan kicked out of the Gorilla Press Slam and the splash delivered by the Warrior. Hogan hulked up and went for the leg drop. Warrior moved out of the way, hitting another splash and scoring the pinfall win. But look at the pinfall here, and look at how Hogan still kicked out on 3. Again, another Hulk Hogan insurance policy. He beat me, but he didn't really beat me. I mentioned that Hogan got a better crowd reaction at the start of the match, but when Warrior got the 1-2-3, the audience was absolutely deafening. I feel like I've been a little harsh here and I really don't mean to be. Previously I spoke about how Andre vs Hogan at Mania 3 gets a lot of flack for the in-ring wrestling, but I still feel that that match is really important and special, and that is how I also feel about Hogan vs Warrior. At WrestleMania 6, the main event competitors I felt did a great job of covering up both of their shortcomings, and they gave the absolute best match they could, given the circumstances. At the time, it worked. The Ultimate Challenge was everything fans could have hoped for, and even bigger than all of this was that we now had a new superstar at the very top of the mountain. Hulk Hogan had lost the WWF Championship to another babyface. At the time it was booked as a passing of the torch, and while we now have the luxury of 2020 hindsight and we all know that it wasn't really a passing of the torch, it was still a special moment in WWF history, and that is something I can really respect. Wrestling isn't always about the moves in the ring or the politics at play. It's also the emotions fans go through from bell to bell and how you feel when the match comes to an end. Hogan vs Warrior delivered on that front. It was a monumental moment in WWF lore, and for that reason, even though the action inside the ropes wasn't a technical showcase, Hogan vs Warrior is still a special must-see match. Wrestling audiences, in particular WWF audiences, were always used to having one guy they loved. Wrestling audiences, in particular WWF audiences, were always used to having one guy they loved. Wrestling audiences, in particular WWF audiences, this I always used to having one guy they loved. Wrestling audiences, in particular WWF audiences, this I always used to having one guy they loved. Wrestling audiences, in particular WrestleMania 6 audiences, this I always used to having one guy they loved. But anyway, Hulk Hogan moved into a feud with the special must-see Earthquake. Boy, there's a big story to tell there. Boy, there's a big story. WrestleMania 6. Normal.
When it comes crashing down and it hurts inside, you gotta take a stand, it don't have to hide.
While WrestleMania 5 in Atlantic City had its own polarising element when it came to the men who main evented the show, nothing divided fans quite like Warrior vs Hogan at WrestleMania 6. The WWF decided to put its two top babyfaces against each other in a match billed as the Ultimate Challenge. Both the Intercontinental Championship and the WWF title would be up for grabs. It was truly a spectacle for the ages that tested the loyalty of die-hard WWF fans. Would supporters rally behind Hulk Hogan, the man who elevated the WWF to heights the company had never seen before, or would they get behind the Ultimate Warrior, an embodiment of a new generation who done nothing but excite fans with his intensity and outlandish character? The WWF's alpha competitor Hulk Hogan would also be put to the test. Had years and years of being the quintessential good guy finally made fans grow tired and bored? Was it time for Hulk Hogan to pass the torch and let someone else bask in the babyface limelight? Let's take a look as we continue our Hulk Hogan series. Our next stop is WrestleMania 6 in the Toronto Skydome, the Ultimate Challenge. WWF Champion Hulk Hogan versus Intercontinental Champion The Ultimate Warrior. Winner takes all. If I'm being totally honest here, Hogan and Warrior's paths didn't cross all that often in the run-up to WrestleMania 6. This was a departure from previous WrestleManias, as Hogan's main body of work throughout a calendar year would all lead to the WrestleMania main event. WrestleMania 6 was different. It seemed like the WWF were willing to forego a deep story, and instead, the company would bank on the insane popularity of both The Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. Looking back, it was neither the right nor the wrong move. Hogan vs Warrior at WrestleMania 6 is absolutely fine the way it is, and it would be wrong to try and go back and rebook things, but at the same time, could you imagine if Warrior and Hogan were given a year-long story that culminated at WrestleMania? It would have been great for sure. Hogan, though, was busy doing a little promotional work for his No Holds Barred movie, and maybe the WWF wanted to get back to basics a little with WrestleMania 6. No deep angle needed. Let the men go out and let the fans tell the story. I wouldn't change a thing if I'm honest, but it's still interesting to think about how the WWF could have told a longer story here with the Ultimate Challenge. Still, what I'm getting at is that this video won't have the twists and turns that were found in the Mega Powers saga, so we'll need to take a look at both men's individual journeys towards the Toronto Skydome to gain a bigger picture. The Ultimate Warrior made his WWF debut in June of 1987, then known as the Dingo Warrior, and immediately the Warrior began destroying jobbers and lower mid-card talent. Real name Jim Hellwig, the Ultimate Warrior was booked as an unstoppable force in wrestling. He was well known for his high energy entrances, his colourful ring gear, and his face paint. His ability to absorb punishment from his opponents was something we had never seen before, turning matches around in his favour in practically no time at all. The man was a spectacle of the ring. There was a legit shift in atmosphere when Warrior's music played in the arena as fans got on their feet to cheer for this over-the-top, real-life superhero. Warrior's first big feud in the World Wrestling Federation was against Hercules Hernandez, leading to a match between the two men at WrestleMania 4. But when we talk about 1988, there was no bigger night for the Ultimate Warrior than SummerSlam. The Honky Tonk Man had set records with his 454-day Intercontinental title reign, but when the Ultimate Warrior was revealed as Honky Tonk Man's surprise opponent at SummerSlam, a real moment in wrestling took place when the Warrior won the IC title. During a memorable feud with Ravishing Rick Rude, Warrior dropped and regained the Intercontinental title while his crowd support continued to grow, and after the Warrior was booked to defeat Andre the Giant at numerous shows across the United States, Jim Hellwig was established as a main event player. Following the Andre the Giant feud, Ultimate Warrior's next stop was the 1990 Royal Rumble, and it was here when the Warrior would stand face to face with Hulk Hogan on pay-per-view for the very first time. After Hulk Hogan had defeated Randy Savage at WrestleMania 5, it was business as usual for the real American. The Hogan vs Savage match was booked on live event after live event, the WWF capitalising here on their big drawing WrestleMania 5 main event by taking the match on the road. Before Mania 5, Hulk had filmed the WWF produced movie No Holds Barred, with Vince McMahon feeling that Hogan had the drawing ability to attract film goers of the late 80s. The movie reportedly broke even. No real profits were made here, but it wasn't through the WWF's lack of trying. In order to sell the movie as a pay-per-view spectacular, Tiny Lister, who played the villain Zeus in the No Holds Barred film, was brought into the WWF for a few matches and appearances. Today we can look back and shake our heads at how silly this may have been, but you have to remember that in the 80s, Hulk Hogan was legitimately one of television's biggest stars, a real household name that fans really couldn't get enough of. The movie seemed like a win-win situation: make more money from the Hulk Hogan name while attempting to break into Hollywood. What really could go wrong? Well, the movie itself was the problem. No Holds Barred was panned by critics, and while some said that Hogan had an appealing on-screen quality about him, the movie itself was a different story altogether. Nonetheless, the WWF would bring the evil Zeus to wrestling audiences whether they liked it or not. Brutus Beefcake and Hulk Hogan defeated Zeus and Randy Savage at SummerSlam 89, and in December, Hogan and Beefcake again defeated Savage and Zeus at the No Holds Barred pay-per-view event. The pay-per-view featured the entire movie before a steel cage tag team match, and it's one of a few pay-per-views that still isn't available on the WWE Network. After Hogan got finished up with the No Holds Barred stuff, he too made his way to the 1990 Royal Rumble. Both Hogan and Warrior were in the Royal Rumble match itself. Warrior entered at number 21, Hogan entered at number 25. After eliminating some competitors from the match, both Hogan and Warrior were left in the ring alone. This was the moment where many fans began wanting something that they didn't know they wanted before. The penny dropped here. It was like, oh, Hogan and Warrior are alone in the ring. We weren't expecting this, but we also can't wait to see what happens next. Warrior and Hogan played it up perfectly too. The two men looked at each other before circling around the ring. The fans roared with anticipation as two of their heroes were about to collide in the squared circle. There would be no clear winner here. Warrior and Hogan took each other out with a double clothesline before the next competitor got in the ring. In the end, Hogan eliminated Warrior by accident, and the Hulkster went on to win the whole thing. What we got here was a taste of things to come, an appetizer for WrestleMania 6. Fans wanted to see what would happen if Hulk Hogan faced the Ultimate Warrior in a one-on-one matchup. The following week, on Saturday night's main event, Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior teamed up to take on The Genius and Mr. Perfect. Hogan and Warrior showed signs of unity in the pre-match interview with Gene Okerlund, and later in the ring, it seemed like both men were on the same page. Warrior and Hogan won the match, but afterwards, when The Genius and Perfect launched a post-match attack, the Warrior accidentally hit Hulk Hogan. After some pushing and shoving, the two men left the ring and the fans were left wondering if it was really going to happen. Would Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior meet in the middle of the ring? Well, fans wouldn't have to wait for long. Hulk Hogan was the man who put forward the ultimate challenge. He wanted to know which force was strongest in the World Wrestling Federation, Hulkamania or the power of the Warrior. Both belts would be put on the line, and the match was made official on February 10th, 1990, Hogan vs. Warrior at WrestleMania 6. At the third main event show on February 23rd, 1990, Hulk Hogan was scheduled to defend his WWF title against the Macho King Randy Savage. James Buster Douglas would serve as the special guest ring enforcer here, and this is interesting because Mike Tyson was actually supposed to referee this match. Buster defied the odds and got a knockout win over Tyson just 2 weeks before the main event show here, so Buster was brought in and Tyson was left out. Tyson would eventually make his way to the World Wrestling Federation at WrestleMania 14, but anyway, it's very interesting here when you consider that Vince McMahon and Jesse Ventura had been hyping Tyson's appearance for a month or so, and then, just like that, Buster Douglas is in and Tyson is out. Anyway, Hogan wins the match when Buster makes the 3 count. A little later on, the Ultimate Warrior defended his IC title against Dino Bravo, and when Warrior got the pinfall win, Earthquake jumped into the ring to help Bravo with a post-match attack. Hulk Hogan ran to the ring to help the Warrior, but Warrior didn't seem too pleased with Hulk trying to help him out. The two men squared off once again. There was no punches thrown, however, and before the main event show ended, both men cut backstage promos. Hogan said he helped the Warrior because he wants his WrestleMania opponent to be at 100% when it was time for WrestleMania 6, and the Ultimate Warrior talked about how the Hulkamaniacs around the world are maybe doubting that their hero can leave WrestleMania with both the WWF Championship and the IC title. 2 weeks later on WWF Superstars, Warrior returned the favour when he saved Hulk Hogan from Earthquake. Warrior had a chance to clothesline Hogan, but he didn't do it. The two looked at each other before Warrior ran back to the gorilla position. And really, that was your build-up for WrestleMania 6. There was also a backstage contract signing that took place and a few pre-recorded promos that aired on television shows, but this was pretty much it. As mentioned earlier though, Warrior vs Hogan didn't need anything more. What you have to keep in mind is that Hogan had just had a series of landmark WrestleMania main events that helped solidify him as WrestleMania's star attraction. For another babyface to come in and challenge the status of Hogan at WrestleMania, it was quite unheard of, but this was all that was needed to tell the story. What brought the Ultimate Warrior to the dance, in my opinion, was his appeal to the young teenage audience of the World Wrestling Federation. The comic book character that had came to life, that kind of thing really captured the imagination of fans who maybe began their WWF fandom as little Hulkamaniacs, but these same fans had grown over the course of 5 years or so. The Ultimate Warrior came across as a bit more edgy and a bit more cool. Of course, Hulk Hogan still had his legions of supporters. Hogan was still the premier all-American good guy and hero, but the character of the Ultimate Warrior seemed to tap into the imagination of young fans in a much more visceral way. The Warrior was maybe seen as more modern and with the times than Hulk Hogan. In the back of many people's minds, this was going to be another Hulk Hogan victory. It's no wonder either. One look at Hogan's WrestleMania history lets us know that the odds were stacked against the Warrior here. The Ultimate Warrior was the underdog at WrestleMania 6 in a way. Not only that, but Hulk Hogan and WrestleMania were just in sync with each other back then. Both existed and flourished because of each other, so you always thought that, with the exception of WrestleMania 4, Hulk Hogan just couldn't be beat on the grand stage. Well, fast forward to April 1st, 1990, the Toronto Skydome, and the Warrior defeated Hogan to become the WWF champion while still retaining the Intercontinental Championship. It was surprising to say the least, but let's look at the match itself before continuing on. First off, the Toronto Skydome, now known as the Rogers Centre, looked absolutely amazing for WrestleMania 6. A good arena helps WrestleMania stand out for sure. You kind of associate the arena with the event in many ways, and WrestleMania 6 is no exception. I always think of the giant wide video board when I think of this WrestleMania. Also, the WWF's production values had gone through some insane improvements since WrestleMania 5. Compare these two shows yourself, the camera work, the overall broadcast quality, the audio for the theme music, everything is much more updated with WrestleMania 6, and it does make the show a little more pleasant to watch. Hogan and Warrior each had pre-match promos and both were memorable, but Warrior's was on a different level. You need to watch this a few times. Warrior did deliver his promos in a peculiar way, to say the least, but Warrior questioned Hogan's beliefs while saying he will bring the Hulkamaniacs and the Warriors together by winning the WWF Championship. It's an insane promo. I can't do it justice by talking about it, and neither can anyone else. Go watch it and feel the power of the Ultimate Warrior. Right, let's look at the match. Now, I don't care what anyone says here, watch it back for yourself. It's undeniable that Hogan gets a much stronger crowd reaction during the entrances and in the opening moments of the bout. We've already talked about how both men had their fair share of supporters, and I'm not saying that there weren't tens of thousands of fans who wanted the Warrior to win, but watch the entrances and you'll see it for yourself. Hogan gets the better crowd response initially. The pre-match stare down was phenomenal. Warrior looked so intense when he stood toe to toe with Hogan, creating a WrestleMania moment by just having both men look at each other. The beginning of the match then played into both men being fan favourites and both men not giving an inch. If Warrior pushed Hogan, Hogan pushed Warrior right back. If Hogan overpowered the Warrior, Warrior would proceed to overpower the Hulkster. The two men even went through this routine with a test of strength in the opening minutes of the match, and while this kind of thing would get mocked in today's wrestling, the fans totally ate it up here at WrestleMania 6. It was the absolute right booking decision here. Have both men look like equals. Hogan fell to the outside and it looked like he had blown his knee out, giving the Warrior a little time to zone in on the injury, but within seconds, Hogan's knee had magically healed and the match played out as if nothing had happened. This was odd for sure. I think Hogan was trying to play possum. He did give Warrior a thumb to the eye afterwards, but it just didn't translate well on TV. Things started getting even more strange when Hulk Hogan began getting the upper hand in the match, something that normally never happened. Hogan's matches were all about the heroic comeback, so it's strange to see a Hulk Hogan match during this time period that had Hogan in the driver's seat for so long. You have to remember that the Warrior was not used to long main event matches though. Warrior was all about the entrance and the character. He would smash his opponents in no time at all, win the match and leave the ring. He was limited in the squared circle, and so was Hogan to be fair, but the Hulkster had the experience here. It made sense for Hogan to set the pace and be the aggressor. If you need proof, when Warrior got back on his feet to mount some offense, he performed clothesline after clothesline, running from one side of the ring to the other without much wrestling going on, to be honest. Now, I'm not trying to pick apart the Ultimate Warrior here. This was his ring style and it worked for him. It got fans on their feet and it made the people scream and shout, and that's really all you can ask for. However, I think Vince McMahon knew that a typical Ultimate Warrior match wouldn't quite cut it in the main event of WrestleMania, and so Hogan was able to take control of the match much more than his opponent. Warrior was able to get a bear hug on Hogan that lasted a very long time. The referee got wiped out after Hogan broke the bear hug, and Hogan pinned Warrior for the 1, 2, 3 while the ref was out cold. This was your Hogan insurance policy right here, folks. Hogan would have won the bout had the referee been there to make the count. The same thing happened moments later when Warrior pinned Hogan, but Hogan had Warrior beat first, of course. The audience went into overdrive when Hogan kicked out of the Gorilla Press Slam and the splash delivered by the Warrior. Hogan hulked up and went for the leg drop. Warrior moved out of the way, hitting another splash and scoring the pinfall win. But look at the pinfall here, and look at how Hogan still kicked out on 3. Again, another Hulk Hogan insurance policy. He beat me, but he didn't really beat me. I mentioned that Hogan got a better crowd reaction at the start of the match, but when Warrior got the 1, 2, 3, the audience was absolutely deafening. I feel like I've been a little harsh here, and I really don't mean to be. Previously I spoke about how Andre vs Hogan at Mania 3 gets a lot of flack for the in-ring wrestling, but I still feel that that match is really important and special, and that is how I also feel about Hogan vs Warrior. At WrestleMania 6, the main event competitors I felt did a great job of covering up both of their shortcomings, and they gave the absolute best match they could, given the circumstances. At the time, it worked. The Ultimate Challenge was everything fans could have hoped for, and even bigger than all of this was that we now had a new superstar at the very top of the mountain. Hulk Hogan had lost the WWF Championship to another babyface. At the time it was booked as a passing of the torch, and while we now have the luxury of 2020 hindsight and we all know that it wasn't really a passing of the torch, it was still a special moment in WWF history, and that is something I can really respect. Wrestling isn't always about the moves in the ring or the politics at play. It's also the emotions fans go through from bell to bell and how you feel when the match comes to an end. Hogan vs Warrior delivered on that front. It was a monumental moment in WWF lore, and for that reason, even though the action inside the ropes wasn't a technical showcase, Hogan vs Warrior is still a special must-see match. Wrestling audiences, in particular WWF audiences, were always used to having one guy they loved versus one guy they hated in the ring. It was cut and dry. Cheer for the hero, boo the villain. This time though, fans had to choose. This, I feel, is another layer that helped make the WrestleMania 6 main event so special. It wouldn't be the last time a huge babyface squared off with another huge babyface, but WrestleMania 6 was the first time it was done on a giant pay-per-view stage, and it's this key element that makes Hogan vs Warrior still stand out to this very day. Anyway, Hogan celebrated with the Warrior afterwards, something that fans see as an example of Hogan holding onto the spotlight. But it's also really hard to imagine the end of WrestleMania 6 without Hogan celebrating with Warrior, giving young fans of the WWF a feel-good moment here to end the biggest show of the year. The Warrior would continue on as the WWF champion, although he did have to forfeit the IC title, as apparently any single superstar isn't allowed to hold two belts at the same time. So why was the match booked in the first place? But anyway, Hulk Hogan moved into a feud with the 468-pound Earthquake. After this, the Hulkster stood up for his country when he faced Sergeant Slaughter at WrestleMania 7, and boy, there's a big story to tell there, but this will all get covered in the next Hogan video uploaded to the channel. In the end, dropping the title to the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 6 I felt was the right thing to do. Hogan did not lose any of his popularity throughout the remainder of 1990, and just a year later he was back in the WrestleMania main event. Normal service would very much resume. You'd hope after WrestleMania 6 that Hogan would see the upside in losing, how he could tell stories through defeat and play on the emotions of his very own fans, but that didn't really happen. Again, we can talk about this a little more in the very next upload. While the Ultimate Warrior would go on to defend the WWF Championship against a series of different opponents, Hogan would find himself feuding with Earthquake soon after WrestleMania 6. John Tenta had debuted in the WWF towards the end of 1989, and by WrestleMania 6 he had been booked as an unstoppable monster heel who would dominate his opponents with his sit-down splash. In May of 1990, Earthquake would target Hulk Hogan, and the Hogan vs Earthquake feud kicked off on a Brother Love segment that aired on the WWF Superstars of Wrestling show. It's became a classic segment, one of those moments that young Hulkamaniacs at the time will remember well to this day. While distracted by Jimmy Hart, Earthquake hit Hogan with a steel chair from behind, and then Earthquake repeatedly hit Hogan with his sit-down splash, resulting in the Hulkster's ribs getting crushed before our very eyes. Hogan got destroyed by Earthquake, and due to his injuries and the loss of the WWF Championship in storyline, Hulk Hogan considered retirement, trying to pull at the heartstrings of the little Hulksters across the world. The WWF aired Hulk Hogan tribute videos to try to further cement that this was all real. We may never see Hulk Hogan again on TV, and if you want an idea of how effective this all was, have a look at the tribute video on YouTube and look at the comments from the little Hulkamaniacs who are now all grown up. Fans were even urged to send letters to Hulk Hogan asking the real American to come back. Hogan stayed away from the ring and away from TV for around 4 months, taking a break from wrestling to further his acting career, something that Vince McMahon felt Hogan wanted to do on the side while remaining a loyal WWF superstar. After the Earthquake attack in May, the plan going forward would consist of a string of Hogan vs Earthquake matches where fans across America could see Hogan get his revenge, and in many ways this feud overshadowed what was going on with the Ultimate Warrior and the WWF Championship. Many people will say that Warrior didn't cut it as WWF champion and he wasn't on the same level as Hulk when it came to generating interest in title matches, but the fact of the matter is that the WWF were still aggressively booking Hogan in storylines that resonated more with young fans. It wasn't really the Warrior's fault. Had the WWF took the same time to build Warriors programs and feuds, there wouldn't have been a problem. The WWF banked on Hulk Hogan a terrible lot during this era, something that would cost the promotion dearly as the years progressed. On the July 28th, 1990 episode of Saturday Night's Main Event, Hulk Hogan came back and the Hulkster announced he was coming after Earthquake, laying out a challenge for SummerSlam 1990. When Earthquake and Dino Bravo came to the ring, Tugboat ran in to even the odds. Tugboat was scheduled to be in Hogan's corner during the SummerSlam match, but Earthquake and Bravo were able to take Tugboat out before the pay-per-view. The Big Boss Man would stand in for Tugboat. And yeah, we have the return of Hulk Hogan at SummerSlam. Those letters that fans wrote obviously worked, and the outpouring of support had made Hogan see the light and it was time for a little revenge. Hogan vs Earthquake would take place before the Ultimate Warrior's title defense against ravishing Rick Rude. The Hogan match predictably ended in a victory for the Hulkster after Hogan body slammed Earthquake on a table. Earthquake then got counted out. In the SummerSlam main event, the Ultimate Warrior successfully defended the WWF title in a steel cage. Sergeant Slaughter's character in wrestling was that of a former US Marine who served in Vietnam. Through the 70s and 80s, Slaughter had worked for the WWF, the NWA and the AWA, becoming an instantly recognisable superstar in his own right. After WrestleMania 6 in Toronto, Slaughter displayed an interest in returning to the WWF. However, Vince McMahon wanted Slaughter to work as a heel. In order to do this, Slaughter would initially feud with Nikolai Volkov, saying that America had gone weak not only because Volkov had been accepted by American wrestling fans, but because America as a country was also going soft. At SummerSlam, Sergeant Slaughter was a guest on the Brother Love show, and Slaughter declared war on Nikolai Volkov, saying that America is too chicken to declare war while Sergeant Slaughter had courage. Slaughter has since admitted that he felt incredibly uncomfortable delivering promos of this nature, but this was nothing in comparison to what was coming up. While the WWF were in their own little world of wrestling in August of 1990, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, was dominating global news. The invasion led to the Gulf War as American and coalition forces tried and succeeded in liberating Kuwait. This is a really quick outline of events here, but it's necessary to bring this up because the WWF and Vince McMahon felt that this international conflict would make for a great wrestling story and a great wrestling heel. It's incredible to think about nowadays, but Sergeant Slaughter would be turned into an Iraqi sympathizer. Claiming now that America had too much freedom, Slaughter would align himself with General Adnan on WWF shows. He would cut promos wearing a headdress while praising Saddam Hussein. Saddam even sent Slaughter a new pair of wrestling boots because Hussein was a big fan of Slaughter's work. And Slaughter would say that the future steps of his wrestling career could hopefully align with Saddam's high standards. Slaughter even announced he would conquer the WWF the same way Hussein conquered Kuwait. A line was being crossed here for the sake of viewership, and while the defeat of Sergeant Slaughter was inevitable and good would triumph over evil like always, a lot of people still didn't like what they were seeing on TV as a form of entertainment. Sergeant Slaughter talked about the public's reaction to this new character in the years that followed, and Slaughter revealed that threats were made to WWF offices that forced him to relocate his family for a period of time for the sake of their own personal safety. That's how serious this got. Whether you think everything is fair game in the world of entertainment is completely up to you, but at the end of the day, a man's family was seriously threatened for the sake of a wrestling storyline and a wrestling character. At the 1990 Survivor Series, Hulk Hogan continued his feud with Earthquake when the Hulkamaniacs, consisting of Hogan, Tugboat, Jim Duggan and the Big Boss Man, took on the Natural Disasters team of Earthquake, Dino Bravo, Haku and the Barbarian. Hulk Hogan was the sole survivor, winning the match for his team. This victory meant that Hogan would wrestle in the final Survivor Series match of the evening, and the show ended with Hogan and Warrior standing victorious with a win for the babyfaces. Sergeant Slaughter, meanwhile, was dominant in his Survivor Series match, eliminating both Bushwhackers and Nikolai Volkov only to get disqualified when it looked like he was winning the whole match for his team. This, of course, was done to keep Slaughter away from the final Survivor Series match. The WWF were going to keep the Hogan and Slaughter confrontation for future events. It's been reported that the Ultimate Warrior lost the WWF Championship due to his lack of drawing power during 1990, and Vince McMahon went back to Hulk Hogan in order to try and regain the viewership numbers that the WWF got during the mid to late 80s. When you look at the pay-per-view buy rates though, this argument becomes a little more difficult to justify. SummerSlam 1990 and Survivor Series 1990 had grabbed more buys than the previous year's events, so I don't think Warrior losing the title was all down to viewership numbers. I also don't think the plan was always to give Hogan the title back at WrestleMania 7, but I do think that the Sergeant Slaughter stuff was making enough noise that it made a tremendous amount of sense to make Slaughter vs Hogan the main event at WrestleMania for the WWF Championship. Maybe Warrior wasn't easy to work with backstage, maybe Hogan made a political play to get the championship back, maybe Vince just didn't like Warrior's matches in the main event spots, who knows, but I don't think viewership was the issue at all here. Bruce Pritchard stated on his podcast too that originally the plan was for Tugboat to wrestle Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 7. Hard to believe, but let's take his word for it for a moment. If that was the case, and the plan was also for Hogan to win the championship at WrestleMania, then Tugboat would have to defeat the Ultimate Warrior for the WWF Championship before WrestleMania in order to set up the big main event. That to me is just difficult to imagine, and so my theory, and it's just a theory, is that the Sergeant Slaughter storyline caught so much media attention and so much external buzz that Vince McMahon felt that the obvious thing to do was to make it a WWF title match at WrestleMania. He wanted to, originally, attract a record number of fans to the WWF's biggest show of the year, and in order to do that, it made sense to present the downfall of Sergeant Slaughter as the main event of the evening, with the WWF title up for grabs. The choice McMahon had to make here was all about who would close out WrestleMania in the last spot of the night, who would headline the show, and Vince decided that Hulk Hogan winning the belt would be more attractive than the Ultimate Warrior successfully defending it. As previously mentioned though, don't ever count out the possibility of Hogan making a political play to get the strap either. At the 1991 Royal Rumble, the road to WrestleMania kicked off with Sergeant Slaughter defeating the Ultimate Warrior for the WWF Championship with a tremendous amount of help from Macho Man Randy Savage. Warrior had refused to give Savage a title shot before the Royal Rumble, and so the Macho Man was getting a little revenge here. Due to the interference, Savage and Warrior would meet at WrestleMania 7, and it can be easily argued that they had the best match of the night, made even more special due to the retirement stipulation that was added to the showdown, and Randy Savage reuniting with Miss Elizabeth after the final bell. To me, this would have been an excellent way to end WrestleMania 7, along with the WWF Championship being on the line. But it is what it is. Slaughter won the gold at the Royal Rumble, and the Royal Rumble match itself came down to Earthquake and Hulk Hogan in the final moments. The Hulkster, of course, won the Royal Rumble. Hogan was interviewed backstage by Mean Gene Okerlund, and during the interview, Mean Gene got word that Sergeant Slaughter was celebrating his title win by defacing the American flag. Hogan took exception to this, saying he would remove the WWF Championship from Slaughter as soon as possible. Shortly afterwards, Hogan was named the #1 contender for the WWF title, and Hogan vs Slaughter was penciled in for the main event of WrestleMania 7. WrestleMania 7 was originally going to be held in the Los Angeles Coliseum, a venue that could seat more people than the Pontiac Silverdome. The Super Bowl in 1991 took place at the Tampa Stadium in Florida, and security was a major concern during the event. Consider the whole Sergeant Slaughter character and what had gone down on WWF shows, and security also became a big concern for WrestleMania, apparently. The WWF would have to pay a huge bill if it were to effectively ensure the safety of talent and wrestlers, and it would have carried an extremely high price tag. Along with these concerns, ticket sales had been incredibly slow for Mania 7. That dream of selling out a stadium seemed more like a joke, and ultimately the decision was made to move WrestleMania into an indoor venue, the LA Memorial Sports Arena. As for the build-up towards WrestleMania and the creative direction of the main event, it was all about Hulk Hogan standing up for America while Slaughter continued to show support for Iraq. Though the overall tone was brought down a great deal, the aggressive nature of Slaughter's tirades were definitely getting tamer as the weeks went on. You had your standard Hulk Hogan beatdowns in the weeks leading up to Mania. This was all stuff we had seen before. A more controversial moment occurred backstage when Vince McMahon asked Slaughter to burn the American flag on TV, according to Slaughter himself. Slaughter refused to do it, so instead a Hulk Hogan shirt was set alight. The real kicker came though when Hulk Hogan said that Iraq would surrender in the war after he defeated Slaughter at WrestleMania. But ironically enough, on the 28th of February 1991, a whole month before WrestleMania, President Bush declared a ceasefire while announcing that Kuwait had been liberated. The war was over. Iraq announced it would accept all UN resolutions, and so the WWF storyline for the WrestleMania 7 main event wouldn't have nearly the same impact as originally intended. The LA Memorial Sports Arena was decked out in stars and stripes as the World Wrestling Federation themed WrestleMania 7 around the land of the free and home of the brave. The WWF had, in very basic terms here, exploited a war in order to sell a wrestling event, and this risk led to a potential stadium venue getting downgraded to an arena. The Slaughter vs Hogan angle did not pay off in the end, and the end result is a WrestleMania venue that failed to impress in comparison to previous WrestleManias. Nonetheless, Vince McMahon still hyped up the main event at the beginning of the broadcast like only Vince McMahon can do. Willie Nelson came out like a walking advertisement for WWF merchandise to sing America the Beautiful, and WrestleMania 7 was underway. Slaughter and Hogan cut promos before their main event match. Slaughter talked about how he was the WWF champion, so Hulk Hogan would have to play by his rules. Absolutely no mention of the war here, by the way. And Hulk Hogan, well, the Hulkster calls himself New Technology, saying that this is the Hulk Hogan of 1991 and he and the Hulkamaniacs have secret weapons to take down Sergeant Slaughter. The men make their way to the ring. Hogan waves Old Glory, and it can't be denied that Hogan was still immensely popular at this point. The match is all about Hogan overcoming the cheating tactics of Sergeant Slaughter and General Adnan at ringside. Hogan is very much in the driver's seat for the first portion of the match. However, Slaughter turns things around when the Hulkster goes to the top rope, leading to Hulk taking the Ric Flair bump. With Slaughter in control, Hogan takes an absolute beating in the ring. The Hulkster gets hit with a steel chair and he gets choked out with cables on the outside of the ring. Strangely, Earl Hebner doesn't call for the bell and the match continues. Hogan gets hit on the head with the steel chair, leading to the Hulkster getting colour. And this gives us a classic visual when Slaughter applies the camel clutch. Hogan won't surrender, so Slaughter tries to pin Hogan with the Iraq flag, but Hogan kicks out and rips the flag up. Hogan then hulks up, big boot, leg drop, and we have a new WWF champion. This match gets destroyed by fans online, and I don't understand why. I know it's predictable, and I know Slaughter certainly isn't Andre the Giant or Randy Savage. The match isn't a pretty showcase of athletic ability, but in saying that, I still think it's a fun main event. The audience went nuts for Hulk Hogan. There was a great atmosphere in the arena, and Slaughter was vicious during this showdown. I feel the whole Slaughter storyline and character overshadows WrestleMania 7 here, and I also think people skip past this WrestleMania because on paper Sergeant Slaughter versus Hulk Hogan doesn't have the same appeal as maybe Hogan versus Savage or Hogan versus Warrior. If you haven't seen it, give it a chance, and if you haven't seen it in a long time like myself, give it another go. The audience helps create an exciting atmosphere for this one, and as predictable as a Hulk Hogan WrestleMania victory is, at least this one played out in a very different way in comparison to previous WrestleManias. WrestleMania 7 then closes with another feel-good moment. America has risen to the top once again, and Slaughter would need to regroup. After Mania, Colonel Mustafa, who we all know as the lovable Iron Sheik, would join forces with Sergeant Slaughter, and Slaughter, Adnan and Mustafa would continue feuding with the Hulkster. The feud ended at SummerSlam 1991 when Hogan teamed up with the Ultimate Warrior, defeating Slaughter, Adnan and Mustafa in a handicap match. That'll do it for today's video. The next Hogan video will look at Hogan's journey towards WrestleMania 8 along with his match with Sid Justice. As mentioned earlier, WrestleMania 7 is kinda overshadowed by the controversy surrounding Sergeant Slaughter, and maybe it's justified too. The WWF weren't the only media outlet who exploited war for viewership gains, but at the same time, the WWF were, and still are, an easy target thanks to the whole scripted nature of the wrestling business. Did Vince McMahon learn his lesson? No, he didn't. Nothing is really off limits in terms of sensitive storylines within the WWE, and if Vince McMahon feels it will bring in a number, then nothing is off the table. The WWF felt WrestleMania 7 could be a record-breaking show at one point, and because this didn't happen, and because of the overall reviews of the event, it's easy enough to see that the WWF would probably consider WrestleMania 7 as a failure. The company would need to regroup. It's time to try something new, and a particular styling and profiling WCW superstar coming into the World Wrestling Federation could be the answer Vince McMahon needed. At WrestleMania 6, Hulk Hogan dropped the WWF Championship to the Ultimate Warrior, and at WrestleMania 7, Hulk was able to reclaim the belt after defeating Sergeant Slaughter in the main event. We talked last time about the decision to put the title back on Hogan, and really, we struggled to think of a good, concrete reason as to why the Ultimate Warrior wouldn't go into WrestleMania 7 as the WWF Champion to square off against Randy Savage. In the end, I concluded that Vince McMahon must have felt that Hulk Hogan versus Sergeant Slaughter in the main event spot would bring in more viewers, with the title being on the line, of course. Hulk's journey to WrestleMania 8 would be much more convoluted than previous years, though. It seemed like the WWF weren't prepared to once again put all their eggs into the Hulkamania basket, as it was understood that Terry Bollea wanted to focus more on his acting career, and so the company needed to build even more main event stars. There was, of course, also the option of bringing in main eventers from other organisations to expand the WWF's roster, and this is exactly what would happen. Not only would the WWF sign some big names, but Vince McMahon was able to sign one of wrestling's biggest drawing superstars of the National Wrestling Alliance in the summer of '91. The Nature Boy Ric Flair was coming to New York, and due to some curious events, Flair was arriving to the WWF with the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. The dream match of Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair, though, wouldn't take place. A ton of different reasons have been given as to why this didn't happen, but let's forget about what the WWE have told us and look into Hogan's real journey towards WrestleMania 8. Some could consider this as the beginning of the end for Hulkamania. Immediately following WrestleMania 7, the Hulk Hogan vs Sergeant Slaughter match was taken on the road. Those who have watched previous Hulk Hogan videos in this series would know that this was kinda standard after WrestleMania. The big matches of the pay-per-view would get brought to smaller arenas so fans who watched the matches on TV could see the rematches live and in living colour. Right up until SummerSlam 91, Hulk Hogan pretty much exclusively worked with Sergeant Slaughter, and at the SummerSlam event, the Hulkster teamed up with the Ultimate Warrior to defeat Slaughter, Colonel Mustafa and General Adnan. There was turmoil behind the scenes at SummerSlam though. The Ultimate Warrior had threatened to no-show the event if Vince McMahon didn't pay him an additional $500,000. Vince paid Warrior and then he suspended him immediately afterwards. Warrior felt the suspension wasn't justified, so Jim Hellwig quit the WWF following the SummerSlam pay-per-view. There was so much going on though at SummerSlam 1991 that would help shape the future of the WWF in both the short term and long term. Bret the Hitman Hart won his very first singles championship at the event in a well received match with Mr. Perfect, pretty much stealing the show thanks to both men's athleticism and selling abilities, something that was seriously lacking in the main event picture. Speaking of the main event, a special referee was appointed for the match. New WWF signee Sid Justice, formerly known as Sid Vicious in WCW, was responsible for calling the match right down the middle, as Big Sid was brought in initially as a babyface. Finally, at the SummerSlam pay-per-view, we saw Bobby Heenan running around backstage with the NWA and WCW big gold belt. Heenan had displayed the title on television before SummerSlam, claiming that the real world's champion Ric Flair was on his way to the WWF and the Nature Boy wanted to challenge the WWF champion Hulk Hogan. I've talked about Ric Flair's arrival to the WWF in 1991 previously. I find this series of events so fascinating that I even uploaded an entire video based around Flair and the big gold belt, but I can't really move forward in this video without talking about the subject again. Ric Flair was arguably the biggest NWA superstar of the late 70s and 80s, and just after Vince McMahon had unleashed Hulkamania at the very first WrestleMania pay-per-view, rival promoter Jim Crockett had consolidated various NWA member promotions that he owned, resulting in Crockett controlling the majority of traditional Southeast and Midwestern territories. Crockett was attempting to do what Vince had just done. Crockett wanted to expand into a national promotion, and while Vince McMahon selected Hulk Hogan to lead the charge for the WWF, Crockett handpicked Ric Flair on his side. To mark the occasion, the traditional NWA Championship belt, better known as the Domed Globe or the £10 of gold, That belt was replaced by what we know now as the Big Gold Belt. Ric Flair was the first man to hold this new championship belt after the Nature Boy successfully defended the NWA title against Barry Windham at the appropriately named Battle of the Belts 2 show held in February of 1986. Flair would go on to drop and regain the title over the years, though after winning the title from Sting in January of 91, Flair was recognised as both the NWA champion and the WCW World Heavyweight champion. The Big Gold Belt was subsequently used for both accolades, so if you held the Big Gold Belt, you were the WCW and NWA champion. Interestingly, Flair lost the NWA title but kept the WCW title when he wrestled Tatsumi Fujinami in the Tokyo Dome. Fujinami wasn't recognised as the WCW champion because he backdropped Flair over the top rope during their match, a move that was cause for disqualification under WCW rules at the time. Flair won the NWA title back at the first Super Brawl show in a rematch with Fujinami, but still, I find all this stuff extremely fascinating. Anyway, to get back on track a little, Flair got involved in a contract dispute with WCW president Jim Herd. Herd wanted Flair to not only take a pay cut, but Herd also wants today's news. Flair disagreed with Jim Herd's demands and general assessments of the Nature Boy character, leading to Flair getting fired and his WCW title getting vacated. Remember, the Big Gold Belt represented both the WCW and NWA champion. Flair was still recognised as the NWA champion and he still had possession of the belt. WCW and Jim Herd tried to get the belt back, but the NWA champion paid a 25 grand deposit when winning the gold. Flair was owed that money and he wasn't prepared to send the belt back until he got his money back. Interest also built up over time. Flair said in his definitive collection DVD that it ended up being around 38 grand. Ric Flair couldn't legally show up in the World Wrestling Federation straight away, but the Big Gold Belt could. So the Nature Boy sent the title belt to Stamford and Bobby Heenan showed it on WWF programming. Heenan would say that the Nature Boy was coming to the WWF. The real world's heavyweight champion was finally arriving in New York, and wrestling fans around the world believed they would finally see the ultimate dream match. NWA champion Ric Flair versus WWF champion Hulk Hogan. It just made too much sense. It was the shot in the arm the WWF needed at the time. Surely Flair versus Hogan would main event WrestleMania 8, and this would result in one of the biggest buy rates in WrestleMania history. Sid Justice versus Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 8 had been the original plan from the beginning, but the arrival of Ric Flair along with Sid getting injured meant that original plans would get reconsidered. At one time backstage, the definite plan was to move forward with Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 8. People have struggled over the years to try and piece together the booking decisions leading up to WrestleMania 8, and there has never been a solid, clear answer as to why the Hulk Hogan vs Ric Flair match didn't take place. Company men and WWE documentaries lead us to believe that the Ric Flair vs Hulk Hogan house show matches didn't draw big enough audiences, and the matches were also stale. Others believe that Hogan and Flair wouldn't agree on a finish, and others claim that Vince McMahon just didn't want Ric Flair vs Hogan headlining the biggest show of the year. Before going into this further, let's look at what happened on TV. At the Survivor Series pay-per-view, Hulk Hogan dropped the WWF Championship to The Undertaker. Ric Flair cost Hulk Hogan the title due to interference, and so we had a new heel champion in the World Wrestling Federation. Hogan reclaimed the title a week later at the This Tuesday in Texas show. The quick title change, I believe, was done for two reasons. Firstly, the prospect of Hulk Hogan regaining the title at This Tuesday in Texas would help sell an experimental pay-per-view being held on a Tuesday night, something the WWF hadn't done before. The WWF wanted to maximise numbers here, and this is evident when you consider how much the This Tuesday in Texas pay-per-view was promoted during the Survivor Series. The Taker vs Hogan rematch was even announced at the Survivor Series show. Secondly, the WWF needed to get the belt vacated before the 1992 Royal Rumble, and they needed Flair to go into WrestleMania as the champion. I'll explain why this was necessary a bit later. So just to stick with what was going on TV, Hogan lost the title at Survivor Series. He regained the title back at this Tuesday in Texas, but due to Ric Flair's interference and the mess that was created at the end of the Taker vs Hogan match at this Tuesday in Texas, the WWF title was vacated by WWF President Jack Tunney, and it was decided that the winner of the 1992 Royal Rumble would be named the new WWF Champion. Ric Flair won the match. By this time, the dispute over the big gold belt had ended with the NWA, so the belt was sent back and Flair was now the WWF Heavyweight Champion. Of note though is that Sid Justice returned from injury at the Royal Rumble show also. Sid eliminated Hulk Hogan from the Royal Rumble match, but Hulk ended up grabbing Sid's arm on the outside of the ring, allowing Ric Flair to eliminate Sid Justice and win the WWF Championship. It was a strange piece of match booking here. Sid had eliminated Hogan fair and square, and in the original pay-per-view feed, you can hear fans cheering when Hogan got eliminated. The WWF made audio edits to the Royal Rumble replay and the Coliseum video releases, even adding in additional commentary from Gorilla Monsoon to try and portray that Sid had wrongfully sneaked up on Hogan, and the Hulkster's reactions afterwards were justified. So Flair was the WWF champion, and Sid Justice and Hulk Hogan were now beginning to feud with each other, with Sid slowly turning into a bad guy, even though Hulk's actions on TV made him look like a total heel. But anyway, it was soon announced that Ric Flair would not wrestle Hogan at WrestleMania 8. Instead, Ric Flair worked with Randy Savage in an admittedly excellent match, while Hogan faced Sid in the main event of the evening. While Flair and Savage had an excellent build-up towards their match involving Miss Elizabeth and her alleged relationship with the Nature Boy, Hogan and Sid's story was all about Sid turning his back on the Hulkster. Jack Tunney announced Flair vs Hogan at a press conference for WrestleMania 8. Sid got upset with the decision, and when Sid completed his heel turn by leaving Hulk Hogan on the February 8th, 1991 edition of Saturday Night's Main Event during their tag team match with Flair and The Undertaker, it was decided then that Hulk Hogan would instead face Sid at the WWF's biggest show of the year. Hulk Hogan vs Sid at WrestleMania 8 is one of my least favourite WrestleMania main events. I just feel the two men didn't work very well together, and this was seriously highlighted thanks to Flair and Savage going on earlier in the broadcast. Along with this, you had Roddy Piper vs Bret Hart for the IC Championship at WrestleMania 8, a well received bout that showcased the athleticism of Hart and the storytelling capabilities of Piper. By the time Sid and Hogan came to the ring for the main event, it felt like we had already seen the best the company had to offer. Not only did the WrestleMania 8 main event plod along, but the finish was completely botched. Papa Shango was supposed to interfere when Hogan delivered the leg drop, but poor Charles Wright didn't make it to the ring on time, resulting in Sid actually kicking out of the leg drop, and Harvey Whippleman, Sid's manager, jumping on the apron. This led to a disqualification. It was a mess, and it was bad, though the fans were treated to the return of the Ultimate Warrior at the end of the show. Warrior came back to help out the Hulkster, closing WrestleMania 8 with a feel-good moment for those in attendance. The WrestleMania 8 main event was billed as possibly Hulk Hogan's last ever match, and for a while it was. Hulk Hogan suddenly disappeared from WWF television screens for around 10 months following WrestleMania, and this brings us back then to the reasons why Flair didn't wrestle Hulk at the WWF's biggest show of the year. Just to confirm, Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan did indeed work a series of house show matches at the end of 1991 and the beginning of 92. It's been reported that Vince McMahon was expecting sellouts for house shows featuring the Flair vs Hogan match, but attendance was just above average. As mentioned earlier, it's also been said that the two men didn't work well together and the matches were flat. These have been the main reasons given by the WWE as to why Flair and Hogan didn't wrestle each other at WrestleMania 8. At least through their documentaries and WWE books and whatnot. When you look deeper though, the thing that the WWE will never talk about are wellness violations and scandals. Put two and two together here and the booking decisions surrounding WrestleMania 8 becomes a little more clear. Hulk Hogan appeared on the Arsenio Hall show in the summer of 1991, just before his SummerSlam 3-on-2 match. Arsenio had previously talked about a doctor being convicted for supplying sportsmen with steroids without prescription. Hulk Hogan's name was on a list of customers. Hogan would go onto the show to defend himself, saying what was reported in the newspapers wasn't true, while reminding viewers that the media had put a dark cloud over the Hulk Hogan character, a character that was supposed to be family friendly and a character who stood up for what was right. The thing is, though, is that Hulk Hogan was lying here. He was lying through his teeth, and we know that because of the 1994 Vince McMahon court trial. Not only was Hulk Hogan lying, but he was doing a really bad job of it. He must have used the word basically around 20 times or more. He talked so much with such discomfort that it felt like a nervous plea for people to believe him. The whole thing just didn't come across well on TV screens. The Arsenio Hall interview did no favours for Hulk Hogan nor the WWF, and with the media breathing down Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan's necks with exposés and damning news articles, the decision was eventually made to get Hogan away from WWF screens. Hogan can make movies, he can make TV shows, or he can get endorsements, but Vince McMahon did not want Hulk Hogan on WWF programming following WrestleMania 8. Vince knew that Hulk Hogan sold WrestleMania tickets, but when the show was over, Hogan should lay low for a while. So this means that Hogan can't become the WWF champion. He wouldn't be there to defend the title after Mania. Ric Flair can't beat Hogan for the title at WrestleMania either, because at that time, a heel wrestler typically didn't win the WWF championship at WrestleMania. Plus, you have Hulk Hogan maybe refusing to lose to Flair on the big stage. Also, Ric Flair was not a Vince McMahon creation, and we all know Vince doesn't like putting over things that weren't built via the WWF machine. There's no doubt in my mind that if Flair vs Hogan did happen at WrestleMania 8, then the only outcome would be Hulk Hogan getting the win. But anyway, with all of this in mind, it begins to make sense as to why Hogan worked a non-title main event to close Mania. Get the match done, get the Warrior back to fill the void, let the fans go home happy. And yes, replacing Hogan with Warrior here may sound stupid for a company trying to deflect juicing allegations, but the media weren't gunning for the Warrior, nor was Jim Hellwig's name mentioned as a customer. Flair, a much physically smaller wrestler than Hogan, can lose the title in the middle of the card to Randy Savage. Vince McMahon feeling here that the reputation of the WWF was maybe more important than the prestige of the world title, probably rightfully so. Funnily enough, Sid Justice got busted on a wellness violation shortly before WrestleMania, and he was fired after the annual European tour that follows Mania. The plan was for Warrior to work with Sid, but that didn't happen. With Hulk Hogan gone, more emphasis was put on smaller or more athletic superstars of the WWF. Bret Hart would eventually become the WWF champion, highlighting the WWF's desire to wave their arms around as if to say, hey look, we have smaller guys that are successful too. Still, the allegations and the scandals wouldn't go away just by removing Hulk Hogan for a little while. When Vince understood that there was no getting away from this and he would have to go to court, Hulk was eventually brought back for WrestleMania 9, and the ultimate snub took place when Bret Hart, a guy who had carried the WWF during the height of the allegations, was forced to give up the WWF championship and watch the title go back to Hogan. Ric Flair, meanwhile, felt he didn't belong in the WWF during the company's push towards the new generation, an initiative that was born out of necessity due to the juicing allegations, and the Nature Boy left the World Wrestling Federation at the beginning of 1993, going back to World Championship Wrestling and receiving a warm welcome upon his return. Hogan vs Flair was a match that we were maybe robbed of. Wrestling fans wanted to see it, even die-hard NWA fans were intrigued to see what would happen, but a series of events led to the biggest match in WrestleMania history not happening. Hulk was leaving, the feds were coming after the WWF, the match didn't go as well as expected at house shows, and WrestleMania history has taught us, at the time at least, that Ric Flair winning at WrestleMania against Hulk Hogan in a WWF title match was incredibly unlikely anyway. The only way Hogan vs Flair could have happened at WrestleMania 8 was if Flair, a cornerstone of the NWA, ended the WWF's biggest annual show holding the WWF title with a victory over the WWF's Golden Boy. It just wasn't meant to be. Of course, Hogan could have won the match and forfeited the title the next week, but the WWF had already screwed around with the championship so much since Survivor Series that the belt was already becoming a bit of a joke. At the same time, it just didn't make any sense for Hogan to beat Flair and then disappear afterwards. The WWF had invested a ton into Ric Flair's arrival, and making him lose to a guy who wouldn't be around for nearly a year would have been incredibly short-sighted. And so we got what we got. There were no issues placing the title on Randy Savage because the Macho Man would still be around afterwards, and so Ric Flair versus Randy Savage at WrestleMania 8 was a really, really good match, so it wasn't all doom and gloom. Our last video looking at the entire career of Hulk Hogan ended at WrestleMania 8. The Hulkster took part in the Mania main event, working against Sid Justice, while the WWF title was defended in the Ric Flair vs Randy Savage match. After WrestleMania 8, Hulk Hogan completely disappeared from the WWF. The wellness scandals were hitting the World Wrestling Federation at full force, and Hulk Hogan felt that now would be a good time to get out of the WWF and once again put all of his focus on Hollywood. Hogan had a real desire to make movies and become a big Hollywood star, and with the feds coming down on the World Wrestling Federation in a big way, there was really no better time for the Hulkster to get out and try to make movies. Along with this, the Hulk Hogan character in wrestling had become stale. Hulkamania had slowed down as the 90s progressed, and it's evident that Vince McMahon was in search of a new top guy to carry the company forward. With the scandals going on, Vince would begin moving the company in a new direction, and just when we thought Hulk Hogan was yesterday's news, the Hulkster was once again brought back into the World Wrestling Federation at the beginning of 1993, and he was pretty much handed the WWF title, infuriating guys who had carried the company on their shoulders during Hogan's absence, in particular one Bret the Hitman Hart. Today's video will look at Hogan's 1993 WWF run, a strange story indeed that even to this day is still hard to make sense of. Now, just a heads up, what we'll do here is look at everything that happened on TV first of all, so we have a clear timeline of events, and then we'll go back and try to piece everything together and try to understand why certain decisions were made. Most of the information we know about the WrestleMania 9 debacle and Hogan's exit comes from producers who are now in the podcast industry, and we also have a lot of information from Bret Hart too, but we also have to take everything with a pinch of salt. No one is really going to know the true ins and outs of this story other than Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon, and both men have been relatively quiet about this period of the Hulkster's career. So now that that's out of the way, let's begin our look at Hulk Hogan in 1993. So let's check out what happened on TV first of all in chronological order. Brutus the Barber Beefcake made his in-ring WWF return on the 15th of February 1993 episode of Monday Night Raw, taking on Ted DiBiase of Money Incorporated. Money Inc., managed by Jimmy Hart, were the WWF Tag Team Champions at the time. They were one of the WWF's main heel tag teams, and if you want to learn more about DiBiase and IRS in the WWF, you should see a link on the screen right now to check out a video I made on Money Inc. Anyway, Brutus Beefcake ended up getting his face smashed in with a briefcase. Brother Brutus had previously taken time away from the WWF to have his face reconstructed after a parasailing accident, so Brutus getting his face smashed once again was supposed to be a big deal. Jimmy Hart showed concern for the Barber. Jimmy had mostly been associated with heels in the World Wrestling Federation, so it was quite odd to see him being so sympathetic towards a good guy. The following week on Raw, Hulk Hogan would be in the building and he'd be addressing what happened to his friend Brutus, but it's the pre-recorded sit-down interview that took place earlier in the broadcast that's way more interesting. Hulk Hogan was coming back, and before getting in the ring, Vince McMahon and Hogan decided they would address the wellness allegations on WWF television. Hulk Hogan said, "When you're at the top of any field, whether it be business, entertainment, sports, or sports entertainment, there's a lot of curious people who want to dig into your past and find out what you're all about. Well, when they dug into Hulk Hogan's past, they found out that Hulk Hogan is a human being. Hulk Hogan is not afraid to admit that he's made mistakes." On a personal level, I've made mistakes. On a business level, I don't always make the right decisions. And even on a peer pressure level, from when I was growing up through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I made mistakes too. We're in the era of the 90s, and notwithstanding the legitimate media, there's a lot of tabloid terrorism going on out there. These are the people who dwell on the negatives and dig up any dirt they can. Even if the allegations are false, they report them anyway, and they don't care who they hurt as long as they personally gain from it. But thank God the Hulkamaniacs aren't all about that. We dwell on the positives. You have to consider how this interview would have came across to younger fans who couldn't have cared less about the news, and those young fans who wouldn't know what a wellness violation was. Hogan was admitting to making past mistakes, and there were plenty of fans who still saw Hogan as an all-American good guy, yet here he was tearing down the media on a WWF TV show while admitting he has faults, something that we never would have seen during the mid to late 80s. It's an interesting piece of raw history that nobody talks about. Anyway, the Hulkster came out of the ring later on. The first thing he wanted to address was the attack on his good friend Brutus Beefcake, and Hogan said that he was going to get revenge for Brutus by going after Money Incorporated. Brutus came to the ring showing off his battle scars, and Jimmy Hart was also brought down to the ring, a now babyface Jimmy Hart. Together, Brutus Beefcake and Hulk Hogan were known as the Mega Maniacs, and with the Mouth of the South as their manager, the Maniacs were going after Money Inc. and the tag team titles at WrestleMania 9. To be fair, I thought this was initially a great spot for Hogan to be in. I was glad that the Hulkster wasn't pushed straight back into the title picture, and if Vince McMahon felt that the star of Hulk Hogan wasn't shining as bright as what it once did, then it made sense to keep Hogan out of the title picture and let others have that spotlight. Bret Hart was our WWF champion at the time. The Hitman was on a mission to prove that the future of the WWF should be centered around athleticism and having good matches night after night. Bret wasn't about being larger than life. Bret could be considered the complete opposite to Hulk Hogan when we consider WWF champions of the 90s. Yokozuna had won the 1993 Royal Rumble, and so the big man was getting a title opportunity at WrestleMania. Yokozuna had made his WWF debut at the end of 1992, and while he did fit the usual evil foreigner gimmick that Vince McMahon seems to love, there was no doubt that Yokozuna was a standout wrestler in his own right. Of course, he had that incredible size, but Yokozuna could also work around the ring. He understood his size was his greatest strength, and so Yokozuna's matches throughout the first few years of his career were always quite the spectacle. The Hitman Bret Hart had gained a huge following over the past year or so. The excellence of execution was on a different level when it came to in-ring storytelling. He had an excellent look that really fit in with early 90s WWF, and the Hitman gained a certain amount of respect from the fans that differed greatly from past WWF champions. The fans of the World Wrestling Federation admired Bret Hart's in-ring abilities, and this admiration helped Bret capture the WWF title. There was also the wellness scandals that kinda pushed Vince McMahon into putting the belt on a smaller superstar, but anyway, Bret Hart was very much accepted as a high caliber WWF champion. Yokozuna had been dominant up until WrestleMania 9, and it did feel like the Hitman was going to get seriously tested on the WWF's biggest show of the year. Before the title match took place at Caesar's Palace, the Mega Maniacs lost their tag team title match against Money Inc. via disqualification. Placed right in the middle of the WrestleMania 9 card, Money Inc. versus the Mega Maniacs ended when Hulk Hogan used Beefcake's protective mask as a weapon. Jimmy Hart tried to become the ref during the bout, but an official ref came out and disqualified the Hulkster. Towards the end of the pay-per-view and just before the Bret Hart versus Yokozuna match, Hulk Hogan cut a promo where he said he just came from Bret Hart's locker room and he could see that Bret was ready to go. Hulk says that Bret is a Hulkamaniac and the Hitman should keep his eye on Mr. Fuji during his match with Yokozuna. Hogan then issued a challenge to the winner of the match, whether it's Bret Hart or Yokozuna, a match we assume would be at a later date. Hogan then implied that Yokozuna would take the belt to Japan, but Bret would make sure the title stays in the United States. Keep this in mind, it's important later. Most of you will know the story here. Mr. Fuji ended up throwing salt in Bret's eyes while the Hitman had the sharpshooter locked in. This allowed Yokozuna to defeat the Hitman and become the new WWF champion. This was the first time a heel won the main event at WrestleMania, and it also ensured that the WWF had a new supervillain right at the top of the WWF ladder. But wait, Hulk Hogan comes down to check on Bret. Mr. Fuji challenges Hogan to step into the ring right there and then for a WWF title match. Bret hams it up as if to say, "Go get him, Hulkster." Hogan gets in the ring, and around 15 seconds later, Hulk Hogan is the new WWF champion. Now, we'll come back to this later, but yeah, Hogan ended up leaving WrestleMania 9 as the new WWF champion, even though he hadn't been officially advertised for a WWF title match. And also, after only working 2 matches in around a year, the first was a house show tag team match against Money Inc., and the second one was the tag team match at WrestleMania 9. To say some people were pissed off would be a huge understatement. After winning the WWF title, Hogan didn't defend the belt at all until the 1993 King of the Ring. He didn't even defend it on house shows. The Money Inc. vs Mega Maniacs match was put on the road instead, while the WWF title played second fiddle. One of the most prolific matches of this time period, though, happened a month after WrestleMania. Hulk Hogan went over to New Japan Pro Wrestling to face the Great Muta in a special WWF champion versus IWGP champion match. Remember earlier when Hogan was afraid that Yokozuna would bring the WWF title to Japan? Well, here's Hulk Hogan bringing the belt to New Japan Pro Wrestling. Hulk Hogan even called the WWF Championship a toy and a stepping stone towards the IWGP Heavyweight title. Hogan tried to say that his interview where he said this was mistranslated, but he actually spoke these words on TV in English. Hogan naturally felt that his comments in New Japan work wouldn't make it far past Japanese audiences, but wrestling tape traders have existed for just as long as what VCR recorders have. Plus today we have the internet available that has helped on more than one occasion to call out Hogan bullshit. Hogan defeated Muta at Wrestling Dontaku 1993 in an entertaining match. It's a real curiosity for sure, and it's another match where you get to see Hogan wrestling at his full ability. After his WWF run came to a close in 1993, Hogan went back to New Japan where he once again defeated Muta. This time Muta was working under his real name, Kishimoto, and the Hulkster and Muta teamed up on the same G1 Climax special to defeat the Hellraisers too. Anyway, let's go back to the States. That toy WWF title wasn't defended once until the King of the Ring pay-per-view. Hogan didn't work any singles matches, and it's all very peculiar to say the least. The Hulkster didn't even show up on Raw. He was featured in a bunch of pre-tapes. One of these was even from the set of Thunder in Paradise, and it really makes you wonder why the WWF even bothered putting the title on Hogan if he wasn't going to be around following WrestleMania. It makes you think that WrestleMania's ending was a quick fix. Anyway, at the King of the Ring in 1993, Hulk Hogan dropped the title back to Yokozuna after a dodgy cameraman shot a fireball onto Hogan's face from his camera. It sounds ridiculous, but this is exactly what happened. Hogan's face was burned, and this gave Yokozuna an opportunity to score the pinfall win. The strap was taken off the Hulkster and it was placed back on Yokozuna. And so Yokozuna would begin a lengthy run with the WWF Championship. Many people think that this was the end of Hulk's run here in the WWF, and while we wouldn't see him on TV, he did work a house show series against Yokozuna around Europe. WWE producer Bruce Pritchard was convinced that Hogan didn't go on this tour, but we have data and even video proof that Hogan was still in the World Wrestling Federation following the King of the Ring. The final date we have for Hulk Hogan in 1993 is the 6th of August. Hogan defeated Yokozuna via disqualification like every other match on this tour. Afterwards, it was reported that Brutus Beefcake, Jimmy Hart and the Hulkster all pulled out of their future WWF dates. All men were still under contract, but all men decided to sit at home. Hulk did have those aforementioned New Japan matches though, but there was no other wrestling dates until 1994. Okay, now we know what happened on TV, let's rewind back and try to make sense of the things that happened and why certain decisions were made. Firstly, Hulk Hogan's return at the beginning of 1993. You'd put this down to Vince McMahon simply not wanting a WrestleMania without Hulk Hogan. Hulk's acting career wasn't really taking off at the time, and the opportunity to come back into the World Wrestling Federation with minimal dates, a large payday, and a chance to win the WWF title once again was probably attractive enough to bring the Hulkster back into the company. Hulk disappeared previously due to the juicing scandal, so let's bring Hogan back, and the very first thing he can do is address the fact that he made mistakes and it will all be forgotten. Next up, why did Hulk Hogan have to win the WWF title at WrestleMania? Well, I think we answered that already. Vince just wanted it. It was a bonus for Hulk coming back, and WrestleManias typically ended with the victorious good guy providing a feel-good moment to send the crowd home happy. The bigger question then is, why couldn't Bret Hart just defeat Yokozuna to gain the same audience response? Well, Hulk Hogan at the time was the stuff of WWF legend, while Bret was still really carving out his own legacy in the company. I certainly don't agree with Hogan winning the belt at WrestleMania 9, and I really think the WWF could have done better business down the road had Yokozuna defeated Bret, and then the Hitman got his revenge at a later date. But Vince McMahon was falling back on what had brought him so much success in the past, and that was Hulk Hogan winning at WrestleMania. Bret got a little comfort by getting promised a WWF title match against Hogan at SummerSlam 93, where Bret would defeat the Hulkster and so the torch would be officially passed, but that obviously didn't happen. Bret wrote in his book that promotional photos were taken with the Hitman and the Hulkster to promote their SummerSlam match. Apparently they were standing in between the WWF title in a tug of war pose, but it was all for nothing. Bret was, and still is, seriously pissed off at how things played out here. Bret thought Hogan was being selfish by not returning the favour, and I do believe that Bret got the short end of the stick here, seeing as he had broke new ground in the WWF by becoming a champion who relied on his in-ring skills more so than being an over-the-top cartoon character. Bret wanted change in the World Wrestling Federation, and it seemed like Hogan had swooped in and wrecked everything that Bret had worked for. You then had Yokozuna, this fierce upcomer who was making headlines as a top bad guy in the World Wrestling Federation. We make a big deal of how Bret Hart felt about WrestleMania 9, but we never consider Yokozuna. The guy had just won his first WWF Championship at WrestleMania. It should have been his moment, and the last picture we saw of WrestleMania 9 should have been that of Yokozuna standing over the fallen Hitman. But that moment and lasting picture was also taken away when Vince McMahon went back in time to deliver another Hulk Hogan WrestleMania celebration. Granted, Hogan's crowd reaction after winning the championship at Mania 9 was incredibly good. The crowd in attendance thought it was great, and you can't really take away Hogan's pop at all, but it's cheap and hollow. It won't last, nor will Hulkamania carry the company for months to follow. There's no forward planning at all. It's an end to WrestleMania really, and that's it. Long term, I personally feel that Yokozuna winning would have been the best for future matchups, and if that wasn't possible, then Bret winning to give that feel-good moment would have held more long-term weight. Hulk Hogan out of all three options would have been my last choice, but hey, it's all up for you to decide. Even Hogan celebrating with the Hitman after Bret successfully defended the title could have got the desired audience response, but anyway, it really doesn't matter now. As for the King of the Ring, the photographer